Is Russia running out of men? And why do I ask this question? Well, when they began the invasion, they were estimated to have in excess of 100 battalion tactical groups, BTGs, each one about 800 men. And what these are very heavily armed, supposedly fairly rapidly moving forces. But the idea of them is that they don't just spread out and, battle through cities and take all the surrounding territory. No, they go for what the Germans used to call the Schwerpunkt. They go for the difficult parts of the enemy defence, and they use their immense firepower on them. But they link up with paramilitary forces, separatist forces, supposedly friendly locals, and those are the ones that kind of spread out and help them actually occupy the ground. And of course that hasn't particularly worked, has it? Because for the most part they're encountering very unfriendly locals, all of whom, if they're of military age, not just men, also women, strapped with AKs and so on. And we're seeing that time and again. And this is a big problem that I have with a lot of these maps we're seeing on mainstream media. They're shading in these big areas, saying that the Russians have conquered them, and actually haven't, because these areas are pockmarked, that's probably the wrong word, but they're speckled with little villages and little towns, and they're not taking them because they don't have the men. They're taking the roads, they're advancing down the roads, and they have a light screen of infantry. Now, one of these BTGs, it has something like 200 infantry, yeah? That's not that many. You really do need more infantry than that. And that was the main way, at least initially, they approached this war. And so these maps are incorrect. They haven't taken all these big swathes of territory. They've taken the roads, and they're doing their best to keep those safe, but they're facing all kinds of resistance from either side. But is Russia running out of men? I mean, one of the issues is that according to Russian law, strictly speaking, you're not allowed to have conscripts in these BTGs. They're meant to be only what they call contracted soldiers, namely ones that have signed up voluntarily previously and are professional soldiers and are fully trained. And yet we've seen with some of the Ukrainian interviews they've given where they, with captured Russian prisoners, which, hey, I can see why they're releasing these videos. It's generally frowned upon to put prisoners of war on camera. But then again, at least they don't look like they've been beaten to hell, most of them, like, the ones that the Iraqis put up, in the Gulf War and so on, where you could see that the blokes have been tortured into giving these things. They don't look like that. But anyway, they're putting them up either way. And some of these are definitely conscripts, and they've said as much, and they look like they're just out of school. They look like conscripts. What kind of manpower does Russia have? It would appear, in terms of the professional army, that they've got something like 90% of their troops employed. I know the rough numbers, but I don't have the precise figures in total, but we'll talk in percentages. It would seem now that they're operating with 90%, even maybe 95% of their troops engaged now. The NATO standard, when you commit to any campaign, is you have 30% in reserve. So Russia no longer has that. Why is it a bad idea? Surely you just want to throw all your men in and take your objectives and steamroll them. No, you don't really. You want to keep men in reserve. Why? Because what if the enemy mounts an unexpected counterattack? The moment you commit almost all your reserves, or all of them, you can no longer move units around from reserve positions to counter enemy threats. You can no longer capitalise on potential weak points in the enemy by reinforcing them from your reserve. So the moment you commit all of your reserve, you're effectively delegating command. If you're a general, you've literally given all your command potential and power down to the lower commanders who are engaged, and you've just got to hope they win. You no longer have a higher strategic level of command. One of the problems is that the lack of men. So Ukraine is a big country. It's about 50 million, the population, I forget now. But it's a big population. It's a massive country. I think it's just slightly larger than France. How many troops do they have per local population? Because that's going to be an issue. It's an issue now when you're arming as many people as you can to form militia, and it'll also be an issue if this sort of declines and deteriorates into an insurgency that lasts longer, which it may well do. How many? Well, at least according to an American general that I listened to, he reckons they have about 4 soldiers, the Russians do, per 1,000 local Ukrainians. And he said, by way of contrast, in World War II, when we were taking Germany, and I assume by we he means the Americans, but I imagine the British had a similar number too, they had over 100 per 1,000 local residents. And that's clearly an issue if you're trying to hold ground and you're trying to just maintain public order and suppress protests and drag away mayors that oppose you and put in your puppet government. That's a problem if you have a resistant local population and you have such a tiny ratio of troops to local population. And this may be why we're seeing the tactic primarily not of doing street fighting. I must admit, I haven't seen any real street fighting where it's house-to-house battles and so on. Why? Because it's so costly in men. It seems the Russians are just going down the roads where they can. They're using this overwhelming firepower they have to encircle towns and just simply bombard them, cut off the supply of electric, cut off any fuel supplies, cut off food, cut off medicine, cut off water is obviously a big one. We're seeing that in Mariupol. And they're going to do the same to Kiev, it seems. And then bring all of your heavy artillery, because these BTGs, they come equipped with a lot of heavy artillery. They're very heavily armed. They're more heavily armed than American brigades. American brigade sort of tactical groups, like their equivalent, tend to have a lot more infantry and not so much heavy artillery. The Russians, far less infantry, far more heavy stuff. And it appears that's what they're doing. And they're mounting these heavy attacks on the cities in the hope that the city will simply surrender, as opposed to doing costly street fighting. What truly amazes me, though, is that when I was listening to these interviews with the Russian soldiers, and to be honest, they seemed like they were talking freely. They didn't seem like they had rehearsed what they had to say or reading off a teleprompter. It seemed they were, some were a bit surlier than others, but as you can imagine, and they're probably afraid of what might happen when it gets back to Russia, what they're saying. So I get that. They are speaking somewhat under duress. But for the most part, I think some of them anyway, I think we're just saying it how it was. And one of the things they were saying was that they got into Ukraine and they just didn't have any maps, or the maps they had were wrong. They're having to go down the roads, but soon the roads got congested because of various armed personnel carriers and different, armoured vehicles don't get taken out the front. And then they were trying to go off the roads, doing their best to navigate with bad maps. They said they didn't have any GPS, any electronic. The funny thing was, if they had their phones on them, they probably could have just used a bit of GPS on those, and they had known precisely where they were. But because Russia wanted to suppress what was actually happening, they've all described this, so I have no reason to doubt it. They all had their phones taken off them beforehand and locked away, presumably because it's so easy for foreign intelligence agencies to just map precisely where you are, and it would give perfect information immediately to America, for example, if they've all got their GPS on their phones, exactly where the Russians are, and that will immediately be fed to Ukraine and so on. So I see why the Russians did it, but it seemed they didn't have any alternatives. So they're walking around with these maps. They're finding that the roads get snarled up with traffic and damage, and then they go off-road, and they're all getting bogged down because the ground's just too wet and messy. And, everybody knows that. I've all heard of the Rasputitsa, the roadlessness of Western Europe. Certainly messed up the Nazis, although I believe they'd have lost regardless. And it appears it's messing up the Russians now in their taking of Ukraine. They're trying to take a very large country. I mean, all these people are all describing went off-road, got bogged down in swamps, or just our equipment broke down because Russia famously, the saying always was, Russia becomes too late with too much. And it's because they never throw away any military equipment, and that's gone back for the last 100 years, really. They just keep it all mothballed and then roll out when they need it. And it seems there's very little backup in terms of keeping the things maintained and supplied. Why is it? So we're seeing all of these different things getting bogged down in swamps and bogged down in mud and just abandoned. Now, I've heard a lot of people say, why on earth are they doing that? That's strange. It's not strange, it's their battle doctrine. So the battle doctrine in the Russian body of dogma is, if you do get bogged down when you're in an armoured column, especially a reconnaissance column, you leave your vehicle and you keep pressing forward to your objective. The idea being that sooner or later, if you're taking the ground behind you, all that stuff will get recovered anyway. So I think all the ones who are seeing on cammed footage, people like finding, armoured vehicles in their back garden and rejoicing because, hey, I've got a £50 million vehicle now in my back garden and it's mine, I'm going to be able to sell it after the war, which it appears that they've actually been allowed to. They've been told anything you capture is yours. I did hear that, I can't verify that. But this is the doctrine. You leave it behind, and then it gets recovered a little bit later, which apparently is different to NATO doctrine. If you get bogged down, run out of fuel, anything bad happens, you destroy your equipment. Whereas in Russia, they're told not to destroy their equipment when they abandon it. They wait for someone to help them a bit later, and they'll leave a small detachment of troops, maybe to protect it if they can. And that's how some of these reconnaissance officers, actually, from the brigade I was listening to, got caught, that they'd been left with a broken down vehicle, and then they were engaged by local militia. And interestingly, what they said was, they said they did have a platoon sniper there, and he shot at the local militia. He didn't say whether he killed whoever he was shooting at, but he probably did. But he doesn't want to admit to that, because the Ukrainians apparently checking their weapons and seeing, have they actually been fired? Have you actually killed Ukrainians or not? And maybe they wouldn't be so kind if they found that they had. But I don't know about that, but that's certainly what one of them said. So they engaged anyway with the locals after they broke down, the local volunteer militia. Well, I say volunteer, it's kind of compulsory if you're a man of military age, whatever. They engaged with them. Sniper took a shot. They did start engaging them, but what he said was, firstly, they were heavily armed, even though they were just local militia. But secondly, he said as well, they were civilians and we didn't feel right fighting them. So whether or not he was truthful there, I think he might have been, because he seemed really upset, this guy, when he was being interviewed. He seemed just embarrassed and upset by what they were up to. He burst into tears when he said, we drove past the border guard place with the Ukraine border, because he didn't even know he was at the Ukraine border until he saw it. And he saw these Ukraine flags kind of, lying on the ground where it had been smashed up. And he saw a bunch of Ukrainian border guards that had been shot and were dead on the ground. And, he was crying in the interview, and I don't think it was faked, really. But whatever, yeah, so that's what happened, that they engaged in this firefight, and then their most senior officer that was left back with them said, we're going to negotiate. I don't know how he did this. Did he wave a white flag? I've no idea how you go about negotiating with angry locals that are heavily armed, but either way he was able to, and he negotiated just their unconditional surrender. So they turned in all their weapons, taken to the local police station, and again, according to him, they were treated well. He didn't look like he'd been beaten up or anything, this guy or any of the ones they put on show, but you never know. I imagine it varies, depending on who's nabbed you, as it always does in war. But I suppose going back to the initial question, is Russia running out of men? Well, if they've got most of their reserves deployed, and the Ukrainians have an army that's smaller, yes, less technologically advanced, but is being supplied with an awful lot of weapons by the West now, and you have your local militia, the problem here, I worry, that the Russians will just continue to escalate these tactics of holding the roads, encircling cities, especially Kiev at the moment, and just bombarding it with everything they have from the outside and from airstrikes as well. And one of the things interestingly they've been doing, because it seems Ukraine still has, I'm amazed that this American general lets this slip, unless it's common knowledge. He said specifically the Ukrainians have 59 fighter jets left, and I don't think they should be revealing that information if it is indeed true. But that's what he said. And obviously they have tons of anti-aircraft weapons. They have these Buk missile systems that can reach high altitude, 40,000 feet or whatever. They have lots of these man-pads, these man-portable aircraft defense weapons. We're sending them over various weapons too. And what the Russians are doing now, it seems that they're launching airstrikes from within their own territory. And of course then if the Ukrainians use these weapons and they shoot down Russian planes over Russian or Belarusian territory, then immediately Russia can claim, well, they're aggressing us, they're attacking us, so they're not doing that. But that means they can be attacked somewhat with impunity, because you can launch air-launched air-to-ground missiles, and that it appears what they're doing as well as using all these multiple launch rocket artillery systems and so on. So, yeah, I think Russia is running out of men. They're running out of trained men. And unfortunately, that's not necessarily a good thing, because one of my mates on Hatman's Discord was saying about in Sun Tzu's Arts of War, you always leave the enemy a line of retreat, because a completely cornered enemy is really going to fight for his life. And the problem here with Russia is there doesn't appear to be any safing way for Putin to extricate the troops, because the demands from both sides are completely incompatible. And so there is no line of retreat, so I can only see the violence being ramped up on civilians, unfortunately. But we watch and we wait with interest.